Hello, good evening. My name is Bhavyashri. So now I want to talk about Spring Boot internals from beans to auto configuration. So before existence of Spring and Spring Boot, developers used to create the web applications like any type of applications by using Java technologies like servlets, JSpace and all. So whenever they have used these type of technologies in order to create the applications, they have faced a lot of issues like the same object has to be created in multiple classes, or all the database related connection has to be maintained by the developer itself, which makes so much of burden to them. So these type of burdens or disadvantages are rectified in Spring and Spring Boot. So Spring or Spring Boot is generally a framework which specifies or simplifies to make the Java application more easier, and by providing so many features in it. So there are two major features in Spring and Spring Boot. Those are called IOC and DI, that means inversion of control and data dependence injection. Inversion of control means, for example, whenever a particular class is there which need another class object. So when we want to use another class object in our class, we have to create object of that class, and then we can use those methods or whatever else we want to use. But here Spring says that no need of creating the objects by yourself. I will create objects. So whatever the objects that we want to create specifies me, and I will create that object, and you can use those objects in entire your application. This is called the feature called inversion of control. That means in previously we have the control to create the object, like developers has the control to create the object, but now Spring take that control. It just inverted our control to himself in order to create the object. So that is called inversion of control. Next one is dependency injection. So after creating that object by Spring, we can use that object in anywhere of our application wherever we need. So Spring creates an object at one time, and that one object we can use in our entire application, which is called dependency injection. And here some other terms are there: dependent class and target class. So there are two major classes, dependent and target class. Here the best example is student and material class. For example, a class is there like student. That student class needs material class object, so we can call that class as target class. So whenever a class needs a particular class object, then we call it as target class. And whenever a class needs another class object, that we will call it as dependent class. Here dependent class may be required by some other classes also, like teacher or maybe some other classes, and also target class may require some other classes also. So these are the definitions of dependent and target class. And then there is something called Spring container. So there is Spring container is there. This Spring container will manage the life cycle of Spring Bean. So whenever we specify the class to create an object in the Spring Boot application, so the Spring will create that class objects and maintains those life cycle methods. So it will create n number of objects as our specification. So these objects are also called as Spring Beans. In Spring Boot, the objects created by the Spring container, we call it as Spring Bean. So this is called Spring Bean, and this is called Spring container. Spring container will maintains the lifecycle methods of Spring Bean, and Spring Bean is the object which is created and maintained by the Spring container. And it not generally creates the objects for every class. Spring also needs some instructions to create these type of objects. So we have to annotate our classes, something like @component and @service, and many other are there. So we have to mention our classes with some annotations in order to say to make the spring to create the objects for these classes. So here this is the parent class, component is the parent class, and service, configuration, controller, all other there are many child classes for this component class. So basing on our requirement, we have to mention the type of annotation to that class in order to say to the spring to create the objects. So here I have created one simple application to explain these type of annotations. So there is one class called myController. So controller means, in Spring, controller means it just handles the incoming requests, and after handling those requests it will pass the responses to the client. It will just take the request from the client, and that request will be passed to the service layer in order to make some business logic. Then at last we will get some response. That response will be transferred by using this controller only. So in order to say this controller is this class as a controller, so we will use something called REST controller. That means we are saying that this is the controller class. It means we don't write any business logic here. We'll just simply pass the requests and take the responses. That's it. That is the task of the controller class. And then, for example, in my application there are different types of controllers are there. So whenever those number of controllers are there, the client has to reach the specified controller to wherever he or she has to go there. So in order to come to the specified controller, he has to mention with some path. So that's why we will mention something like some request mapping. That means whatever the request is taken from the client, that will map with this controller. So in every controller, if you simply write like this, we cannot come to this control directly. So we'll mention some path here. Something called API I will write here, or controller also, anything we can write. So this is my controller now with this path, and then I want to use some methods. This method has to communicate with the service, but whenever the controller wants to communicate with the service, it has to communicate via interface only. So I'll write some method. This method will interact with the service, and whatever the service methods are there, it will take the method and it will just print that method here. It will just results the response to the browser. So I have written like this. So now this method has to, now my controller class method wants to communicate with the service. So it will be possible via interface. So I have already written one interface method. This is the interface which is having some get message method. So as it is a interface, we cannot mention the body over here for this method. So I have used some other implementation class which is implementing that service interface. All the business related logic will be written in the service layer only. So this is my service interface, service implementation class which is implementing that service interface. There I am overriding that method and writing some business logic here. So I want to use this method in my controller. this controller is only for controlling the request, so no need of writing this methods, no need of writing business logics here. So I'll just call this method. In order to call this method, generally we write like this, something like service interface, and then service interface equals to, so generally it is a interface, so we cannot create an object for the interface, so that's why we'll use this one. With the help of the implementation class we can create the object, so that interface I'll use. Now it is returning some message, so that message I am passing it to the client. But here we are only creating this object, so in order to use the feature of the Spring, we no need to create this object. So we'll say that Spring to create an object, so we have to create this service implementation object. So we'll come here and we'll say some annotation like service. Since it is a service layer class, so we will annotate with service, or else even if you annotate with component also it will work, and it will create an object. Now it will create of this object, and now I want to use this object and I want to assign to my this interface reference. So I'll make it as private, and then whenever I want to use this object, I need that object. Here I am not creating and also not injecting. So here there are two concepts called, whenever we want to take the object created by the Spring, we have two concepts called dependency injection and dependency lookup. So either we can use dependency injection, dependency lookup in order to call those objects. Here dependency injection means that whatever the objects created by the Spring container, those objects will just inject to our classes. Or simply we can say that by using some annotations, that Spring only inject that object to our class. And then dependency lookup means we will call this container and we'll ask this container to get that object. That is one more concept. So here first of all I will use dependency inject. So I'll say that I'll use auto white. This is one of the annotation to inject the object is created by the Spring. So here Spring is creating one object by using this @service annotation, and I am using by using @auto void injection. So it will create the object now. So now it will not create any null pointer exceptions. So I'll just run this one. So in order to run the application, we can use run as maven build, and here we will use the commands like clean package. It will create all the temporary files. After we have seen build success, we can simply run this one by using command called clean spring boot run. Now everything is fine. Now it's fine. Previously I have already run that application in some other port, so that's why it is showing. So whenever we are running one port and again we are trying to run the same application with some other port, it will show some error. So we have to terminate one port and again we have to restart it. So now I'm using that object here, and I'm using that object by using some simple annotations. So in order to verify whether it is right or wrong, so I'll just run in the browser. First of all, I'll write HTTP. It means I want to talk the controller with the service. So it is the one protocol which is helpful to communicate with the services. And then I'm saying localhost, which means it is in my computer. The application is in my computer and then it is running on the 8080 port, as it is already here. Here Tomcat started on port number 8080, so that I have to mention. And then here controller, it is the path name, so I have to mention here. And then after going to that controller, I want to call this method. Here whenever you want to call this method, it will not directly call this method. So whenever I run this one, so it is showing some white label error page. Why? Because after going to this controller, we haven't said to which path it has to go. So for example, there are multiple methods like this, so we haven't mentioned to which method or to which path it has to go. So if you haven't mentioned, it will stop here and it will show some error like this, some 404 error it shows. So for this method also we have to mention some path. Here I will write get mapping. You can write get mapping also, post mapping also, but browser by default it will only take the get mapping. That means there are HTTP methods are there, get, post, put and all. By default browser will take get method, so we have to mention get mapping here. And then even though if you don't mention path here also, it will come. Why? Because now at present there is only one get mapping is there, it will just come to here. But if there are two methods are there like this, something I have written like this, get map. There are two methods with get mapping. So whenever there are two methods with same request mapping, so it will confuse and it will throw an error. So I haven't saved this one. Now it will run. Now it is here only it is showing error. Why? Because it is confusing. There are two get mappings are there, so to where it has to go it will confuse. So then we have to mention the path, otherwise no need to mention that path, so it will not confuse now. So if I run this one, nothing will happen. So after passing this path, it is coming to my method and it is calling some other class method. So it is calling service interface. This service interface we cannot create an object, so there is one implementation class. To that we are creating object by using some @service annotation. So this object is assigned to my service interface reference, but here it is not assigning normally. We are using some injection here like @autovide annotation. That means we are injecting that object to our class, which is called dependency injection. This is called field injection. That means this is something called field. So this field we are using this auto void, so we call it as field injection. And one more injection is there, something called constructor injection. Constructor injection, simply we'll write constructor to this class. In this class we'll mention that one. Then we'll say that now the same auto void can be used here in order to say it as a constructor injection. But if you want to use field injection, you have to mention @auto void. You have to use this auto void definitely. But when we want to use constructor injection, this auto void is optional, because whenever this class object is created, at that time it will be created. This Spring object is also created. So no need of mentioning. Even though if you mention also, not mention also, it will create an object. So I'll just run this one again. Here there is no error, and just I'll run this one. So nothing is there. Even though if I uncommented that one also, it will run. So it has run properly. So even if I run here, so nothing happened. So this is called dependency injection. And one more concept is called dependency lookup. That means we are asking container in order to provide that object. So in Spring container there are two containers are there. One is Bean Factory and another one is application context container. So there are two containers are there. There are two types of containers. Application context container is more advanced as compared to the Bean Factory. So now in this container we have this object. So we'll ask this container to get that object. This is called dependency lookup. We are asking that one. So here this application context container also one interface. So we have to create object for that one. So we want to create an object for this one. So we can simply use constructor injection. As I previously said, just like this service interface we can create object for this application context also. Now by using this reference we can call the object of this class. So this container already has this object of this class. Whatever we are saying to Spring that to create an object, those objects are stored and maintained by this application context container. So we can simply ask that one. So here I'll ask that application context to get denote. So here we have to mention whatever the class object that we need. So now this application context will give you object of this service interface, so that we will store in service interface. Here we will store. And now by using that one you can call this method again. Now I will just save this one. Again I will run this one. So now it's fine. So the mic controller or service interface or service implementation, all these classes are user defined classes. That means the developer itself is creating these classes. For example, some classes are there which is already predefined. Let us say math class is there or random class is there. So all these are predefined classes. So if I want to create an object to these classes, I can simply write like this. I'll take two classes. So I want to use random class object. So first of all I have to create a random class object first. Here I will create random So now I created object for random. So the same reference I can use it here. So I want to generate some random number. So if I want to use this reference, if I want to use the object of that random number, I have to create this object manually, because it is a predefined class. We cannot write simply @service or @component that we have written here. So we have to do like this. But Spring also supports to create object for predefined classes also. So after saving that, I'll just simply call here. So it is generating some number. So now if I want to make the Spring to create object for this random class also, I'll take some other class called app_config. You can take any name. So I have created one class as app_config. Now I have to create an object of this class. So I will make it as @configuration. Why? Because this is the configuration class. What does it mean is, so whenever the Spring is running our application, it scans all the classes which are annotated with something like component or service or configuration and etc. So it will scan these type of annotated classes and it will create objects for those classes. but for configuration class it will not create for that one, and this is useful so in this configuration class we'll write methods. So whatever the predefined classes are there, whenever we want that predefined class object, no need to write the object like this. For example, if not only this class, if many other classes also needs the same type of predefined class, like random class is used by some other classes also, but every time we are creating that object in every class means again creating of many more objects and wasting of memory. So we can use another advantage of Spring in order to create the object for random classes also, in order to create the object for predefined classes also. Here we'll just simply say in configuration class we annotate this method with @bin. That means, so whenever the Spring scans this class, it just create the objects which are having the annotations of bin. It will scans all the methods in it and it will create the objects for it, and then whatever it is returning, it will create those objects. So now Spring creates object for this random class also, which is a predefined class, by using this @bin symbol, @bin annotation. So by seeing this @bin, it understood that we have to create the object for this class also, which is a predefined one. So we can simply use this one here. It is simply like that, as we have already used here. We can simply write random here. So because of this app config, it was already created an object for this random predefined class, so that we can simply use it here by using this constructor injection. So it will create object for this one also, and we are using it here. So I'll save this one. It is not showing any other. Here if I generate this one, so it is simply generating the random number. So this is called configuration annotation and @bin annotation. So I want to use some other class, like something like JSON. So this JSON is a Google library which is converting our Java object to JSON object and JSON structure to our Java object. So if I want to use this one also, for example, So even though if I am writing like this, it is not recognizing. Why? Because this JSON is not in our jar files. So in our class path there are many jar files are there. So here these are the jar files that we have, but in this one we don't have this one because it is not default one. So we can get that library by using Maven dependency library. So this is the repository where we can get all the dependencies. So I'll just simply copy this one, and then in pom.xml, so this is the main where the application starts from, and here we'll write the dependencies. So whatever the jar files, for example, whenever if you use Java technologies, we have to install the Tomcat and we have to make the connection to it. So here we'll simply write the dependency logic here, and it will automatically include that one also, include that Tomcat also. Here after inserting this one, if I run this one, now it will recognize this one. I just want simply to return this JSON object. So I can call that one simply. So first of all I make a reference for that one also. And then make it as constructor injection. So here in app config, so we have return one method in order to we have write one method in order to return JSON. So we can use that object over here. So I'll write some other method called public, something called string, some JSON object which will take two numbers. You can take anything here. So I want to pass this. So now I want to take one other class. Some request DTO. Now I create one more class. In some DTO package. So I will create something called my request. So this is my Java object. So my class is there. So this is my class. Here I am getting I am writing setters and getter. and I use that method. So I use that class to set those values. So after setting these values, now this is the request, this is reference. So this reference, if I pass over here, so it is taking my Java object and converting it to the JSON. Now if I want to use this one, so I use get mapping, and then I say that something called JSON, and I say so this is the URL. So these are called request parameters, and these numbers are request values, parameter values. So if I pass like this, it will give you the JSON object. Here you have to give it. Then if I pass it again, now it is coming. So now I have taken one example of JSON. So here in app config, as I said, if I use @configuration, it will create the objects for the methods which are annotated with bean. But here, even if I am not annotated with bean, it is creating an object. Why? Because in Spring it will provide some feature called auto configuration. That means, so in Spring Boot projects there is something called, so whatever the predefined jar files are there in Spring Boot, it has created object for those jar files, and those objects are also there in the Spring container. So whatever the JSON is there, that is already presented. So JSON, this JSON is already there in Spring Boot project, so as a jar file. So it created already an object and it is inserted into Spring container. So whenever you want to use that one, you no need to specify here. We can simply mention in configuration class, so that it can directly creates an object if @bean is not there. So for example, if @bean is there, so auto configuration means it will create the objects for the jar files which are already there in Spring Boot projects. If those jar files are there in our class path, so as I already included the dependency in pom.xml, so here I included this JSON dependency. So now my class path contains this. Now my class path contains the JSON jar file here. So this JSON jar file is already there in Spring Boot, so it will create object whenever if you don't mention this @bean, whenever if you don't mention. So if you mention, it will not create on the basis of conditional on missing bean. So it follows some @conditional on missing bean. So it follows some condition. That means if @bean is not there, the Spring itself is contained the object by itself. But here this random is not a jar file in the Spring Boot project, so it will not create manually even though if you don't mention @bean here. But if you don't mention @bean also, on basis of conditional missing on bean, it says that if you don't mention @bean here, it will automatically create the bean for that method, bean for this library, and it will inject here whenever you want. If I run this again, I have to close this again. If I run this one, now if I run this one, now you can see that so this is called auto configuration. And next I want to talk about this @Spring Boot application. It is the combination of 3 annotations, something like component scan and enable auto configuration and configuration. So the Spring Boot application is the combination of these 3 annotations. So first of all, whenever our application comes here, like by controller, whenever our application comes here, it will run this main method and then it follows these 3 annotations. It performs the process of these 3 annotations. So one by one I'll explain. So component scan means it will scan all the packages and sub packages which are annotated with component or by its subclasses annotations. For example, component is the parent class. Its subclasses are @service, @configuration, or @controller, or all the subclasses of the component class. So this component scan will specify will check all the packages under this package. So this is the main package which is having this main application class. So under these packages, means under these sub packages or this package, it scans all the classes which are annotated with component, configuration or service, like parent or subclasses annotations. After that, basing on that, it will create the objects of those classes and then enable auto configuration like JSON, whatever the jar files that are already there in Spring Boot project. Those jar files is already there in our class path. It will create object for those classes but basing on conditional on missing bean. So some condition it will create. So if I am not creating, if that means if programmer is not creating the classes, if programmer is not creating the object, then Spring will create. If programmer is creating, then Spring will not create. So that is, it is sealed. And configuration means whatever the classes which is having configuration, in those classes the Spring will check is there any methods which are annotated with bean. So is there any method if there are any methods which are annotated with beans, then it will create object of those methods returned value. So these are the three three steps performed by the Spring Boot application. Is a combination of these three annotations. So